Okay, moving on to 6B. So this is a 12-mark question. So getting on to a bit of the more meaty questions. So let's have a read of this. So with reference to figure 2 and extract A, so again, very nice of them to give us exact figures to look at. So when it gives you something like this, when it prompts you what to look at, I will literally just look at them too, because that's where the examiner wants you to look at, basically. But with reference to figure 2 and extract A, discuss the possible impact. So this is an impact question. So it'll come with the exam technique, but when it's asking for impacts, a lot of them should be actually in the extract, so remember you're looking for impacts. To discuss the possible impact of the supermarket monopsony power, that's quite interesting. Supermarket monopsony power on both food suppliers and consumers, so on both food suppliers and consumers. Okay, so now this is actually, it looks like quite a tricky question for consumers, for students. Why? Because most students learn monopsony power in terms of labour markets. So they learn it, for example, the NHS exploits doctors, exploits nurses with this monopsony power to push down wages. But also, a lot of students forget that monopsony power also exists in labour markets, but also exists in buyer markets. So this is a great example where supermarkets, since they're the sole buyer of like food, for example, food supplies, they can exploit the food suppliers. So there's food suppliers in the supermarkets. The supermarkets are the only ones that buy that food supply off the food suppliers. So a better, less tongue twister example is Network Rail. So they maintain all the railway infrastructure in England. So like the actual like tracks and stuff like that. So every single place in England, in Great Britain, is the railway tracks, the infrastructure is owned by Network Rail. This means for the actual train tracks, the suppliers of train tracks in Great Britain only have one supplier to sell to, which is Network Rail. Therefore, Network Rail exerts monopsony power, because it has power to push down the price they can pay these railway suppliers, as they are the only buyer of these like rail tracks. So they were a bit of a side note, but there's some good real world examples of monopsony power, especially in buyer markets. But yeah, back to the question. To discuss the possible impact of supermarket monopsony power on the food suppliers and then on consumers as well. So this is, so to get full marks, to get anywhere near full marks in this question, because it says and, you're going to have to mention the impacts on both suppliers and then separately on consumers. So I actually remember in extract A we were reading at the start of it, so let's look for food supplies firstly. So in extract A, I remember this part of the paragraph, it was actually talking about the effects, the monopsony power effects on food supplies, and let me just try find where that was. So yeah, food supplies are struggling to remain in business since supermarkets are engaging in intense price wars, which of course states the relationship between the suppliers and the supermarkets themselves. So basically, if supermarkets are cutting price, the suppliers are being affected. Okay, here's a good line. It blames aggressive, so the UK's food suppliers, they're blaming aggressive price cutting by the supermarkets and delays in payment to food suppliers. Now that is a very good impact, if I was to say so myself. So aggressive price cutting by supermarkets and the delays in payments to food supplies. So you can say one impact of the monopsony power is that because they have this power, because these food suppliers cannot sell to anyone else, they're exploiting their power by doing things like delays in payment to food suppliers. And then if you just continue reading, another impact here, so further problems include food suppliers being forced to pay excessive amounts of packaging. That's another impact. So for excessive amounts of packaging, what is that? Packaging is a cost, so it means that costs are rising for these food suppliers. And this is where like you kind of build chain of analysis. If costs are rising, and like it says here, a lot of these guys are small, medium-sized businesses. If costs are rising, what could happen? The simplest one is that they could just close down. They might be forced to shut down because there might not be enough profit in the market for them to continue. They might not be making enough sales. Or you could also say, if costs are rising, what else could happen? It means that the quality of goods being produced could decrease, because since if costs are rising, they can either continue producing the same quality and just take lower profit margins, or they could lower their quality, therefore mean that costs also lower and keep the same profit margins. So there's quite a few points there for the suppliers, and pretty much what I would do with this question, by the way, I'll probably do one KAA, because of course the 12 marker, you do a KAA, then a valuation paragraph, then you do KAA, then you do another valuation paragraph. I probably would do my first KAA on the impacts on suppliers, and then I would just do my second KAA on impacts on consumers, probably, because it sounds like the easiest way to split this. And here I'm just writing out my KAA for my first paragraph. So we went through quite a few points there. We went through, for example, costs. We went through delays in payments to food suppliers, aggressive price cutting. So you can, any of them work. As long as you build a chain of analysis around them, any of them work. I just choose to pick the one about the costs, basically. I just pick the one about they pay excessive amounts for packaging, and then I'm going to relate it to costs. But for application also, so that's a bit of application I've just taken from the extract. But for application also, because the question does say, with the reference to figure 2, you could also just throw in a bit of figure 2 where, so what does figure 2 show? The proportion of food suppliers failed to meet the grocery code of conduct. So I would say, for example, Tesco has failed to meet 30% of food supplies. Yeah, whatever you want to say, just any application, any bit of figure usage, it works. So yeah, 100%. Okay, so the way I would go about this KAA paragraph, so like I've written it out, so K is, so the way I'd start it, so like I said, this is going to be the impacts on suppliers paragraph. The way I'd start it is just a monopsony definition, and also one little fact here, Edexcel did not actually require you to know the monopsony diagram. It would actually work quite well here. It's not needed, of course, because monopsonies is not on your spec, but it depends what time of the year you're watching this video. If it's not too close to your exams, I would actually suggest you learn the monopsony diagram because it's quite useful, and it's really useful in like chains of analysis, for example. But if it's too close to your exams, you don't need to worry about it. But so your K, so the knowledge, I would start with just defining monopsonies. So I'd say like dominant buyer of goods in the market that use their monopsony power. They use their power as the sole buyers in the market to therefore exploit those food suppliers, knowing that food suppliers have no other choice, they have no one else to sell to, so they can use that power to exploit them. Then I would go on to say, like, but just adding a bit of application. For example, this is shown as, and then I'll just quote this, or quote a bit of figure 2 with regards to the GOC's exploitation stats. Not the GOC, I just mean this. GCOC. Then, just like I was saying before, I'd pretty much say the same thing. So I'd go from my application. So forced to pay excessive amounts for packaging. Then I'd start my analysis. This means the costs for these food supplies is going to rise. If the cost for these food supplies is going to rise, this could lead to two different effects. One effect is that with costs rising, it could mean that these firms start making losses. If these firms start making losses, you can maybe introduce short run shutdown points, long run shutdown point. They may move beyond their long run shutdown point, therefore be forced outside of the market, something like that. And then I'd also say another effect is with costs rising, it can also lead to quality falling. Why? And then explain the scenario I explained previously as when firms costs rise, they have a choice. Either they maintain profit margins or they basically let their profit margins decrease. And if they let their profit margins decrease, the way they do that is by lowering quality. Therefore, it could have knock-on effects. And maybe they're saying knock-on effects, and the knock-on effects ultimately would be to the consumers. But since this paragraph is focused on suppliers, I probably wouldn't mention that here, and probably would actually, it's a good point to link into your second paragraph. So let's do the paragraph on KAA paragraph on consumers. Okay, so now just using our brains, let's try to think of some of the effects on consumers without even using the extracts. So if these supermarkets are exploiting the food suppliers, so the supermarkets are getting lower prices, the supermarkets' costs are reducing, how is that going to translate onto consumers? So if you think about it, if supermarkets are paying less for their food supplies, it means that they can charge it a lower price. This therefore means that consumers are probably being positively affected, and consumers are paying lower prices. You can link that to things like, the main thing you're going to link that to is consumer surplus as the main topic with consumers paying lower prices. But yeah, so it probably would just be positive effects on consumers as they pay lower prices. And then the other, we could actually mention the little negative effect that we mentioned earlier. Oh, actually, before we move on to the consumer side of things, of course, we need to evaluate this, since in the 12 marker, there are 4 evaluation marks. That's why I suggest you do one at the end of your first paragraph, one at the end of your second paragraph, so you can pick up 2 evaluation marks in both. But yeah, how would we evaluate this? So we're evaluating that basically, so what we're trying to do with evaluation, we're trying to say that the supermarkets are not to exploit their monopsony power, or we're trying to find a limitation basically of where they might not actually be able to exploit this monopsony power. And this again reminds me straight back to the extract, which it talks about at the end. Classic Classic, it links really well too. So in monopolies, one of the best evaluation points you can talk about is just CMA regulation, where monopolies can't exploit their powers with exploiting consumers with high prices, since CMA will regulate them. They will stop them exploiting consumers, and that's pretty much the exact same point I'm going to give here. So it talks about GCA, which is, I'm guessing, the regulatory body for groceries, and it says here, the GCA has the power to fine supermarkets up to 1% of their annual sales if they break the groceries code of conduct. So my main evaluation point here is going to be, however, this depends on the level of GOC regulation. As if the level of GOC regulation is high, this means supermarkets will not exploit their monopoly power, as they will be scared, they will be fearful of them being fined their 1% of annual revenue. Thus meaning the negative effects on these food suppliers, like the increase in costs, shouldn't actually be felt by these food suppliers. But another really interesting thing, which I actually went through earlier, is the monopsony definition. And the pure monopsony definition is one dominant buyer or seller in the market. Whereas here, we're talking about monopsony power, but there's quite a few firms in this market. There's quite a few of these firms that are exerting this monopsony power. So you could actually just evaluate the definition saying that pure monopsony power, when we talk about monopsonies, like the NHS, for example, even the NHS isn't a pure monopsony, because there's the NHS and then there's also a bit of private healthcare. But regardless, in this evaluation point, you could actually evaluate. However, this depends on the definition of monopsony power, or definition of monopsonies, as the definition of a monopsony is one dominant buyer or seller in the market. Thus, as there are lots of firms here, such as Aldi, Sainsbury's, Lidl, there are several firms here. This does not align with the perfect definition of a monopsony. And I'm going to give you way too many points here. By the way, you only need to try one of these, but I just love evaluation because it can help students pick up so many marks, and it's such a big skill you need. But another evaluation point that's just popped into my head is a standard one I used to go through for every single question. If you don't know what I mean by a standard one, watch my A-star evaluation video, most viewed video on my channel, because it's the best video I've ever made. But basically the point is time frame. So it depends on the effects between the short run and the long run. So the way I'd word this here, I'd say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the time frame. As in the long run, and I'm going to explain it now, in the long run, is this very sustainable? Is it sustainable that these firms are being exploited? They're basically just about surviving? Not really. So in the long run, if these firms are being exploited too hard, they're going to leave the market and they're going to shut down. Therefore, in the long run, supermarkets are probably going to have to pay these food suppliers a reasonable price, so they all don't end up leaving. Since if all of these food suppliers are being exploited and they leave, there's no one to supply the supermarkets with food. So that's pretty much, I'd word that into like a few lines, saying that however, this depends on the time frame, as in the long run, supermarkets will have to pay these food suppliers a reasonable price, a reasonable appropriate price, as if they don't, there'll be no supplies left in the supermarket industry, thus meaning that supermarkets cannot operate, and of course affecting their profits, revenue, sales. But yeah, like I said, you only need one of those points. Just explain it in slight detail, and that should be your 2 evaluation marks for this paragraph back. Okay, moving on to the next paragraph, which is going to be on consumers. Now, before we even look at the extract, let's just use our brains on what the effect on consumers is going to be. So essentially, we know the supermarkets are exploiting their monopoly power on these food suppliers. So the supermarkets are lowering their costs. Because what does monopoly power do? It allows these firms to lower costs because they're paying them basically an unfair price. So if supermarkets have lower costs, what does it allow supermarkets to do? It allows supermarkets to have more margin, they have more of a buffer area, so it allows supermarkets to charge consumers lower prices. And what are the effects, what are the impacts of that? If consumers are charged lower prices, it means that you could talk about several different things. Consumer welfare, consumer surplus is improved. And that's basically a paragraph in itself without even having to look at the extract. And then remember back to the last paragraph where we mentioned a bit of if the suppliers' costs are high, this could be translated to worse quality. And if quality is worsened, it will mean that obviously that is going to have an effect on the consumer, isn't it? Since if consumers' vegetables are no longer good quality, it could have effect on like health, several effects on consumers basically. So you could actually write, if you want to write a negative effect on consumers, is that with the suppliers' cost rising, it's going to translate to worse quality for consumers. But yeah, let's have a read of the extract just to show you this, or just try to pick up any more points. Because we've pretty much read through the entire extract now, the main thing that pops into my mind is just this. That's the main bit of application I would use. So the price wars, so even this, aggressive price cutting strategies. There's been several price wars between the supermarkets, and like it says, the prices paid by consumers have fallen 1.7%. Therefore, the main paragraph I would write here is just the impact on consumers, is that prices are falling, and then just explain the reasons why the prices are falling due to the monopoly power on suppliers. Therefore, it means that the supermarkets have lower costs. They can charge consumers lower prices. Also, there's heavy competition in this market. Therefore, with price wars, it means that they're undercutting each other, meaning that consumers are receiving even better prices, improving their surplus even more. Now, thinking about evaluation, lots of evaluation points here as well. This is why once you get evaluation, it's so easy. But you can use the time frame one. If you didn't use it last time, you can use it here, where we're talking about price wars. We're talking about prices dropping for consumers. But realistically, short run versus long run, how long is that going to last? In the short run, there probably are going to be quite a few price wars. But in the long run, how sustainable are those price wars? How sustainable are the constant drops in price for consumers? Since one of the main reasons that supermarkets will pursue price wars is for market share, market power. That is usually a short-term goal, whereas in the long term, supermarkets, they have shareholders. They will be more bothered about profits rather than just solely gaining market share. And an absolute classic one, one of the main ones in my A-star valuation video, I'm not just plugging this for the sake of it, it's a very good video. But economics evaluation is all about assumptions. So we're constantly making assumptions, from ceteris paribus to this. But one assumption we made is that as these supermarkets have the monopsony power, they're going to exploit the suppliers, and therefore they have lower costs, and they're going to pass these costs on to consumers. But in reality, even though the supermarkets have lower costs, they don't need to pass it on to consumers. They could just take basically an increased profit margin. So that's a really good evaluation, saying that however, this depends on the assumption that supermarkets are going to pass on this reduced cost to consumers, and that's an absolute A-star evaluation point right there. So that is a 12-mark question done. Now, I've said lots of points there. You obviously do not need to write all of that. You just need to write your 2 KAA paragraphs, your 2 evaluations, and that is it. But this is more for revision, more to get your brain fired up in that economic sense. So then if a question like this comes up, a similar question comes up, you've gone through a lot of these points and you've understood a lot of these points, and obviously it's a very good revision.